Thank you. It is such an honor to be back here for my 10th visit, the 11th Caitlinfest, and I am reminded every year about that one year that I missed. So in case you're wondering, I missed a year. But I'm so delighted to be back here. It is so wonderful. Every time I come here, it always feels like I'm running into old friends and meeting new ones all at the same time. So in case you don't know, I run Miss Caitlin's School of Blacksmithing, and what I do all day, every day, is teach folks blacksmithing. And so one of the things that I have learned over the years is basically I am deeply in the process of learning to understand how people learn blacksmithing and what sorts of barriers stand in the way and what ways we can make it easier to pick up blacksmithing. And I'm just going to be doing a couple of short little demonstrations today and illustrating some of the ways that I have taught my students to be able to blacksmith a little bit more efficiently and to pick that up a little bit more efficiently. Are we good on the camera? Fantastic. So what I'm going to do first is show a candle holder, and I think you can see this on the screen. Is that right? Yes. So this candle holder is just a flat base plate here. We've got a tiny little piece, 1/4 inch round for a handle, and then we have a pre-cut piece to wrap around the candlestick. And we're going to start off with marking the center line on this piece here. Now, I have this really great tool. It's a center finder. Some folks may know this from doing woodworking. Basically, what you have is 2 pins and this tiny little pin in the center that can scratch the metal. This is very similar to what folks will have sometimes for woodworking. This is an easy way to find the center of things. If you don't want to measure and then have to do math, this is the cheater. Basically, you're going to take your piece of metal, set your center finder at an angle so that the pins are on either side, and then scratch it back and forth. Is this coming up on the camera? Awesome, sweet. Okay, cool. Now what I can see is this tiny little shiny line, and that helps me to find out where the center line is, so that it'll be a much easier process to get those holes drilled and everything lined up. I've actually pre-done that on my other piece, but it's also been in the forge for a little while, so we'll see how much it comes out on the other end. What I'm going to do here is texture the edges of this piece. Texturing the edges gets us right off the bat into talking about how to hit hard enough so that you'll actually be able to see the metal moving, right? Now, when I first got started blacksmithing, I really struggled with this. Hold on. I do not come from a background where I spent a lot of my early days hammering. I didn't have a lot of upper body strength when I got into this, and so when I first took up blacksmithing, I fell in love with the craft, which is easy to see why, right? But I struggled deeply to actually move the metal, to get that metal to actually do what I wanted it to do. And it took me literally years to figure out how to move that metal efficiently. And so it's become really a passion for me to teach other people how to move that metal efficiently. And one of the things I like to remind folks is that the lazier you are, the easier it'll be for that metal to move. And that sounds super crazy, right? Everybody thinks that we blacksmiths are out there working just as hard as we possibly can. And of course, some days we do that. But of course, if we're doing this in a sustainable fashion and a way that is kind to the human body, it's so much better to be able to do this at a level that is sustainable and doesn't do damage to the body, right? That sounds pretty great, right? So the idea here is that we're using the big forces like gravity and inertia to actually move that metal efficiently. And in order to use those big forces that don't get tired, what we need to do is we need to have a serious conversation about our hammers, particularly the hammer handle. On my hammer handle, you can see here that it is thinner in about this spot and much wider down here. And that allows the whole hammer handle to sort of act as a wedge. So if I'm holding it really loosely in my hand, it's going to stay in my hand regardless of how tight I'm holding it. Well, not totally regardless. I can't let my hand open up. But otherwise, it stays in my hand pretty efficiently. And so I can swing it back and forth, and it will move in my hand a little bit, but it stays in there. It's not flying across the room. And that allows my whole arm to be much more relaxed. If you've got a death grip on that hammer, you've got so much tension in all of your joints that you're going to end up with repetitive stress injuries. And so this is one of the ways that we can really reduce the wear and tear in our bodies. Make sure that hammer handle is designed to stay in your hand. I see a lot of hammer handles that are cylindrical, and it's just so easy to have your hand slip through. The other thing I often see is people putting gloves on their hammer hand. And gloves on the hammer hand, yes, sometimes it's appropriate, but what ends up happening is that with that gloved hand, you can have that hammer slip through because gloves tend to be a little bit less sticky than skin, right? So bottom line is, I bet you all have been on this planet long enough that you know a little something about how gravity works. None of you are going to be surprised if I hold this hammer really loosely and I just drop it down on the end of this piece and nothing much happens to this piece of clay. But if I just take that same hammer, raise it up, and drop it down, I get all the power I need with so little effort, right? This is a 2-pound hammer. I'm raising it up just a bit above my eye line and letting it fall, and I have so much power here, right? And that's pretty effortless for me to do for a long time. One of the things that I see a lot of the time is that when I'm working with students that are new to the craft or haven't spent a lot of time hammering, oftentimes as they're lifting the hammer, you'll sort of see this. The arm kind of breaks a little bit as they're getting that hammer up. That's a good indication that the hammer is just a little bit too heavy for you, right? If your wrist doesn't have quite the stability to lift that up, then it's probably time to switch to a slightly lighter hammer. I also want to mention that I, as a human, have some days when I feel really strong and some days that I don't. And so I like having hammers of a variety of sizes so that when it feels like it's too much to lift that heavier hammer, I can go for something a little bit lighter. I want to make mention here that Bruce made this amazing mechanical representation of a human, in part based off of an experiment that I did with an intern this past year. We basically built a scale model of a human arm with a hammer attached to it and just rigged it up to a rope with a pulley and tried out how a mechanical arm would drop a weight like a hammer. Had a couple of little force measuring devices. The technical aspect of this is one that took months to figure out. But one of the things that was really cool is we got the chance to do the mechanical arm side by side with a human of roughly the same proportions and dropped the hammer at the same time, and we're able to see the similarities and differences in how that motion sort of unfolds, right? The human was slightly different than the mechanical arm in terms of which part of which joint unfurled first. But one of the things that you definitely see is when you are hammering effortlessly and you're raising that hammer up, you're actually moving this part of your arm, right? So when you're getting those power blows, you actually have the shoulder, elbow, wrist, and then the movement in the hammer in the hand itself that are all points of articulation. And because of the way that this hammer drops, you actually end up having a little bit of a whip-like action, which means that you end up getting a little bit more force out of it than if you're just dropping that hammer, if you had just something straight dropping down. You get a little bit more mechanical advantage that way. And so, of course, we have this really lovely left-handed, apparently, articulated arm. And you can see this, the upper arm, the forearm, and then the wrist actuation. In this particular one, there's no movement in the hand for the hammer itself, probably for safety reasons, because the hammer might go flying across the room. There are better ways to do this, but we're just going to go not quite on the anvil. The aim is a little bit off, but you can kind of see what we're talking about. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull out my first piece here. And it's got quite a lot of forge scale on it right now. And I'm working close to the edge, just going ahead and getting those corners broken down. And as I'm landing my hammer for this, to really make that show up, you'll notice that my hammer's tilted down a little so that the toe of the hammer is hidden. So we get that really, really lovely catching light on the edge there. Now I'm running out of heat a little bit, so I'm going to go ahead and take that a bit further. It's a little hard to do this where there's a camera here. I don't think you can see this part. I promise you it's about the same as the rest. I think we got pretty much everything here. One more hit. All right. So what we're doing here is just catching a little bit of light. I'm going to pop that in for one quick more go. And it's really nice to be able to catch a little bit of light there because it helps to make it look a little bit more hand-worked. I use that sort of thing a lot on like the backing plates for my hooks to just make it look a little bit more hand-worked, a little bit, playing around with a little bit. With those plates, it's really quite easy to deform the edge of your piece of metal, even if you're doing it cold, in comparison to sort of like smushing around in the middle of the plate, because when you're working at that very edge, you have less resistance of just the air, right? As you're hammering down, that material has to go somewhere. If you're hammering in the middle of the plate, you have the resistance of the rest of the plate. If you're hammering right on that edge, there's no resistance. It'll move a lot easier. Just get those last little corners. I often like to just draw out these corners just a little bit more. One of the things I want to mention here, which is a thing that I like to talk about because I don't think it gets shared an awful lot. We blacksmiths get exposed to a lot of heat, a lot of burns. And it's really interesting because I've taken many classes and I've gone to many places and nobody's really talked about burns in the same way that I have. So I keep saying this message in the hope that it continues to get out, which is when we're working with mild steel doesn't even start to glow until it hits about 977 degrees. So it's close to 1,000 degrees, right? It doesn't even start to glow until that point. We're working with it when it's well above that temperature. When it drops below that temperature, it stops glowing, but of course it's like 950 degrees, right? So much heat energy, right? And we soft, delicate little humans start to burn at about 112 degrees. That isn't even close to boiling temperature for water, right? And so we're talking about so much heat energy. If that heat ends up coming in contact with your skin, that heat will immediately go into your flesh and then start to spread. And the challenge is that, yes, you already have a burn there, but that heat energy is in your flesh and continuing to spread. So unless you cool that off as quickly as you safely can, that heat energy will continue to cook you until you actually have all of that heat evened out, or until you've cooled it off completely. And so that means running it under cool water until it doesn't feel like it's giving off heat anymore, right? So a lot of times when this sort of thing happens, you'll run your hand under cool water and it'll feel better while you're running under cool water, and a little bit later when you pull your hand out, it starts to throb again. That just means you're not done. Put it back under that cool water, right? And the outcomes are amazing. Like, if you do that, it can dramatically reduce the eventual severity of the burn. And so it's like, hey, just take a second and address that thing, right? So right now, what we've got is a piece that is fully textured, I think. And so I'm going to go ahead and pop that down and turn my attention over to this other piece that's in the fire right now. Now, one of the things I want to mention, I'm working with beginners. And so a lot of the time, beginners, when they come in, they don't necessarily know what the limitations of the tools are versus their own inexperience. So I like to have tools that reduce the variables, right? These are tools that tend to work really well, right? So that we're eliminating those variables. These particular tools, I really love the Tom Tongs. I'm not getting sponsored to say this, but I especially like them because you end up having this. Can you see this? You end up having this little window in your tongs that allows you to hold weird-shaped objects, which is great news because weird-shaped objects is pretty much what we're making most of the time, right? And so it allows you to grab past the ends of things. This is a terrible example. I did not plan this, right? So you can grab past the ends of things, and it pops right out this little window here. Additionally, there's a little notch on the side that allows you to hold things crossways. This is not great for hitting on because, of course, the leverage that you're dealing with here could allow this thing to pop right out of your tongs. But I think that those two design elements here, that notch on the side and that little window, really dramatically increase the functionality of these tongs. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go on and make a point at the very end of my piece here. Let's talk about points. Points, in my experience, are some of the most challenging skills for beginner blacksmiths because there's actually a tremendous amount of things happening here. The basics of making a point would be to take a piece of metal, hit down on the very end of it, and of course, as you're hitting down on the very end of it, you're smushing that metal, right? Smushes always happen between the hammer and the anvil. Smushing always makes it thinner and wider, but for points, of course, we want it to be thinner and also thinner. And so what we want to do is hit down on one side, turn it a quarter turn, and hit down on the other side. It is absolutely crucial that you are hitting at the very end of your metal. This seems both very obvious and not so obvious, right? Because we kind of think, oh, we're hitting at the end here. But it turns out that if we actually really look at the end, this hammer is missing the end entirely, right? So it's hitting here, and the end of the metal is all the way out there. If you're not sure, like if you're having trouble with your points and it's like not developing the way that you want it to, take your camera, set it up, and videotape yourself doing this. I guarantee that either you're not hitting hard enough or your hammer's not all the way out at the very end of your metal. Once your hammer is all the way out at the very end of your metal, that point will develop much faster and easier. How do you get it all the way out there? Well, there's a trick to that. And the trick is this. It matters a lot what your eyes are doing. If you're looking at your piece with a soft focus, your eyes are going to be kind of around here. If you're looking at the very, very end of your metal as if it's the most fascinating thing on the planet, your eyes will land there and your hammer will land there too. This is like if you've ever seen like a dog who's really into playing catch, right? And you take the ball and you're about to throw it, and that dog is 100% invested in that ball, right? You can see that focus physically in the whole body, right? And so if you can focus at the very end of your metal in that way, you simply will hit there more often. Now, one of the fascinating things that I've started noticing is that when I tell my students, if you're focusing at the very end of your metal, you will see your metal jump. In other words, move between each hit, right? Because one of the weird things about this is that our hammer is not see-through. So the moment of impact, we can't actually see what's happening. So there's a moment when we can't see our piece of metal, but if we're looking there and we're keeping our eyes absolutely glued on that one spot, we should see after that hammer moves out of the way that it has significantly changed. If it's not significantly changed, it's probably the case that we're not hitting hard enough or we're hitting in a place where we don't expect to. Now, as we're doing that point, oftentimes we get down to the part where we're trying to get it pointy and we keep hitting the anvil by accident. And a lot of times when folks are hitting the anvil by accident, they think, oh gosh, my aim is off, right? It's really easy to internalize that. But if you're looking in the right spot and your hammer keeps hitting the anvil above your piece of metal, that's generally just because of the fact that the anvil itself is getting in the way. If you move the whole thing out towards the very end, your hammer, that far corner of it, is going to drop below the anvil surface, thereby making it more efficient for you to do those points. And it's pretty costless, right? Like, you don't have to be any better than you already are. All you have to do is just keep doing what you were doing in the middle of the anvil all the way out at the end. Now, I can tell the minute that somebody's eyes are not at the very end of their metal when they're doing a point, and here's why. As soon as that piece of metal slips over that far edge of the anvil and they're not noticing it, they don't have their eyes glued at the very end. They're looking somewhere back here, right? This piece of it where we're looking is so crucial. And one of the things that I'm not hearing a lot of conversation about in blacksmithing, and it's so crucial because literally you should be able to say to people, I'm gonna hit here and my eyes are looking here, right? Because if you don't know where you're looking, you really don't know where you're hitting, right? A lot of the times folks will end up hitting down all the way to make that point. And it is a technique that humans use to figure out where their hammer is landing, right? And so if you're developing that accuracy, you hit kind of back here a little ways, and then as you go, you're moving your hammer further and further out. That's a great technique for developing accuracy. And also, it's important to note that any hit that's not at the very end of your piece of metal is kind of pointless. Right? So all of these blows out here are hits that you are sort of wasting in service to developing better accuracy. And so it's great that you're doing that while you're learning. But as you go, your aim should be hitting at the very, very end, right? Now, I teach people to make points on the face of the anvil. It is also true that it is a little bit more efficient, depending upon the size of your piece of metal, to work it on the horn of the anvil to draw it out a little bit faster. I gotta say, for beginners, that's a lot, right? So much of my focus is reducing the variables that folks are working with so that they can actually pay attention to the things that need to be done, right? Awesome. So I'm gonna pull my piece out, pop a little point on it. I also tend to keep my piece of metal flat to the anvil when I'm teaching beginners, and that's because most of the time what I'm doing, it doesn't really matter if that point is totally centered on the bar or not, and if I end up mishitting a little bit, my bar is going to bend, right? So if I hit out over air, that bar will bend. Pop it back in real quick. If you have a bar that's bent, the protocol for fixing that bent bar is this. Notice the arch. Make sure that that arch is on the anvil so that there are 2 points of contact, and then hit down on the top of that arch. If you end up having an entirely mangled up piece of metal, that's okay. You just find the various different arches, set it down on the anvil, hit down on the top of that arch, find another one, hit down on the top of that arch, and work it through until you've straightened everything out. Please note that there's a couple of exceptions. If you've got a set of tongs that are holding onto it, which I hope you do, because otherwise what are you doing to hold it in place? Your tongs will be keeping it off the anvil if those tongs are over the anvil. So you keep those tongs off the anvil and it can be fully flat to the anvil. Also, if you've got a section that's been sort of smushed wider, it would be really hard for you to get this sort of flattened out without keeping it off the edge of the anvil. Basically, we want to flatten it to the anvil as much as possible. So let me go ahead and pull this out, take it a little further. I want to draw this end piece out just a little bit. So I'm hitting back a little bit further, and I'm getting it pretty stabby. And I've got quite a lot of forge scale because it's been cooking in there for quite some time. Knock that all off. Now I've gotten this down to a square point. For what I'm making here, I actually want to round this out a little bit. To round it out, I want to knock down all those corners. If I was just take that square point and sort of roll it back and forth on the anvil as I was hitting on it, it would actually twist. Those corners would provide the leverage to twist my piece if I wasn't hitting fully flat to it. So what I want to do is hold it up on the diamond. This is no longer square. Hold it up on the diamond. My action is to hit down along my piece to knock that whole edge down, rotate it over, knock that whole edge down. So I'm taking it from square to octagonal. And then I want to knock all of those edges down, take it from octagonal to 16-agle to 32-agle, right? Knock all of the edges down until it looks like there's not any obvious corners on it. And then my movement changes. Instead of going lengthwise, then I want to kind of hold my hammer in place and rotate my piece underneath it. So I'm going lengthwise. Now, one of the things that I like to point out to people, you're watching this right on the TV, so you have pretty much the same view I have. One of the things we don't talk about often enough is the fact that oftentimes when we're blacksmithing, we really can't see what we're doing. right? We have to kind of like rotate our piece around to see if it catches a little light someplace. We're taking a little bit of that ambient light around the shop to notice whether there are facets or edges. And we're really looking for those subtle color differences. And that's especially hard when our piece of metal is glowing so brightly. I mean, it's so brightly it's sometimes painful to look at, right? And so one of the things that oftentimes happens is that folks will start to ignore color information, and as soon as their piece of metal gets dark enough where they can actually see if they're hitting on a facet or an edge, then they start hitting. But of course, once it's gotten dark like that, it's no longer nearly as malleable. And so we're hitting on that metal when it's too cold. In beginners, I see this all the time. It's like, finally, I can see what I'm doing. It's too cold to work on it, right? So I'm not offering any sort of assistance with that. It's just a reality of the challenges of blacksmithing. So I'm just rolling this back and forth. But I'm picking up just very, very faint color information here and light information as I'm noticing if it's round or not. And maybe that's my glasses. Maybe I need to clean them. Are you seeing are you able to see that it's rounded now? All right. Are you able to see that it's square now? So I'm getting nods on both of those questions. Not able to see it. Okay, cool. That's what I kind of thought. Because I am standing directly over it, and it's a little tough to see, right? What I'm going to do now is I'm going to bring my piece out and I'm going to bend it over. The protocol for bending things to make it into a little loop, this protocol works for any size metal that you can actually physically move. The protocol is bend it down, bend it back, flip it over, dip it over the edge of the anvil, and roll it down as you're hitting on the back side of it. And I'll walk that through in clay as well. Everything's okay? I'm not going to get the sword of Damocles falling on my head. So here's that protocol. I'm actually going to show this as a fishtail so I think you can see it a little bit better. Setting it out over that far edge, hitting it down. And as I'm hitting it down, I want you to see where my hammer's coming from and where it's going to. It's starting up here. It's hitting down past the actual piece of metal and carrying through below, right? So I'm actually using sort of a scuffing blow, and my hammer's a little bit out from the edge of the anvil. If I was hitting directly at the edge of the anvil, I would actually be smushing my metal, so you would actually see this little like chunk taken out of it, right? If I flipped it up, you would see how it's been smushed in. But bending always happens into air, right? For this bending action, I want you to think of a pair of scissors that are a little bit loose, and you go to cut a piece of paper, and instead of it cutting, it bends the paper. That's because the two blades are not coming directly next to each other. They're coming out a little bit. So it's important for it to be a little bit out from the edge of the anvil. We hit it down, then we flip it over. Sorry, let me back up for a sec. So frequently, what I see is that folks will get it started and then they'll hit back in towards the edge of the anvil. And you can see on the camera here that as I'm doing this, my piece of metal wants to scoot back across the anvil. This is not a very efficient use of my energy, right? Because all that energy is getting scuffed off by me having to kind of brace my piece on the anvil to sort of muscle my way through that. But it changes if I'm hitting down. I'm using the edge of the anvil as a fulcrum to get that to bend. We bend it down, then flip it over, and then hit it back. but it has to be at least a 90-degree bend to the original bar for that to work. If it's a little bit further open, when I go to hit it back, it's actually going to lift my whole piece up. All right? So if that happens, I want to take it a little further in the previous step. For this, I want to get it all the way back until it's shaped like the letter J. J is there shaped? Yes. This is the proper orientation for you. I always have to do that. So when I say J-shaped, I mean that this part is up parallel to my original bar. If it's further open, the next step is not going to work very well. So I want to take it back until it's J-shape, not L-shape. And this process here, I'm taking a screaming hot piece of metal and I'm hitting it directly back towards my lap, right? We might want to talk about that a little bit. What we're going to do is we're going to make sure that those tongs that we're holding our piece with are braced right up against our body. By bracing them against our body, the full force of impact is directed at the very top of your bar. And so it's just going to curl that top of the bar rather than you having to muscle it back up against your hammer, right? Once you get it to J shape, what I like to call it is flip it, dip it, and roll. What I'm doing here is I'm using the far edge of the anvil as sort of the shape that this section is making here, right? So I'm using that far edge of the anvil and rolling my piece down while I'm hitting on it. Functionally, this is exactly the same as hitting here and lifting this up. The main difference there is that this is really challenging for beginners, right? If you've got kind of a little bit of lack of control with your hammer, it's really easy to smash this to smithereens. This is a lot harder, but it's a little bit safer, a little bit more delicate, okay? So let me go ahead and do those. Bends take less energy than smushes do. So oftentimes you can do all three of those bend moves in one heat. So out over that far edge, you can see my hammer's coming up and going past the edge. Flip it over. I've already got it close to J shape. Brace it against my body. It's fully on the anvil. If it's off the anvil in that position, it will sometimes bend down as you're hitting on it. Now I've got it to J shape or a little bit beyond. I'm going to flip it over, dip it down past the edge of the anvil. I've got the very end of that tip on the edge of the anvil here. And I'm hitting on the back side as I'm rolling it down. Now what I've got here, I've got a loop, but it's not fully closed up. If I wanted to close that up, roll it up so that the loop is up and hit down. Sometimes with a little bit of what I call English, right? Hitting a little bit back as I'm hitting down. And that closes that right up. So that gets me the little curly cue at the very end. I'm going to flip it around so I can do the smush on that back side. Now, a lot of times when we're doing points, folks will end up, their points will end up getting off from fully square to sort of diamond shaped. If you end up getting it diamond shaped, this ends up making it much harder for your point to get super stabby. I like to think of it, I've got this, this pointer here. The pointer is beveled on both sides. If you are making a point and it ends up getting a little bit off square, it is functionally a double bevel. So congratulations, you've learned a new skill, right? Now, the downside to that is that if you have a double bevel, it's going to make it much harder for that piece to actually get to pointy. To make it pointy, we want to rotate our piece around so that it is as narrow as possible as we're looking down on it on the anvil. And you can see here, this looks so thin. I mean, it's basically just a line on the anvil. It's much thinner than it is, of course, wide, right? So I look down on it, seeing that thin side hit down on that edge, and it's going to smush this way. One of the things that oftentimes happens is that I have my students, and they're looking at one side of things, and they're like, okay, this side is wider. I have to hit on this side to make it thinner. And it's not getting any thinner. It's just getting wider. Or it's getting, I'm using words inconsistently here. They think they need to hit on the wider side. But actually, to bring that back towards square, we need to rotate it around to hit on that narrowest side. All right? We want to hit down on that narrow edge to smush it all back into shape. We're basically reducing the leverage. If your piece ends up staying a little bit wider like that, it's going to end up not coming back to pointy. It's going to start pulling out of your tongs. If you're watching somebody who's inexperienced doing this, or if this is happening to you, you can sometimes subtly note that your metal will jump a little bit. And that's either the case that you've got a little bit off on diamond shape, or your piece of metal has gotten a little bit cold. So what I'm doing here is I'm going to set just a little bit on the edge of the anvil here and do a half-faced blow. My eyes are looking at the intersection of the edge of the anvil and the middle of my bar. So my eyes are glued right at that point. That means that my hammer is going to land half on the anvil, half off the anvil. And that gets us this really beautiful little shoulder. All right. I'm going to flip it back around now and bend the cup of that handle. What you didn't see me doing, or perhaps you did, I was doing some complex three-dimensional logic there to try to figure out which side needed to be up for me to make that little smush shoulder happen on the right side. One of the really beautiful things about working with round bar as blacksmiths is that if we get it wrong, we just twist it around, right? And what I love doing is I love making the whole bend in the piece and then capturing it at the other end in the vise and then twisting the side that's bent. That gives us a little leverage to be able to grab it a little bit more easily. So what I'm going to do here, I need to get that metal hot enough so that the full length of the bend is going to be nice and screaming hot. But this little curlicue at the very end, well, that's nice and delicate. And since I'm going to be hitting on the very end of my metal to start that bend, I want to protect it. So I want to quench off just that very end so that as I'm putting it out over the horn of the anvil, it's going to bend first and not smush. So I'm quenching it just in some water here. I would normally do this all the way out at that very end, but you can't see it then. So I start by hitting at the very, very end. I'm going to have to do a little more here. And then I bring it back to the face of the anvil to bring it back to J shape. And then I can, again, just that same protocol as before. Bring it back around. Now that got all messed up. Working on the horn of the anvil here, making sure that I'm hitting over a little bit of air. And I've got a little bit of a bend. I'm sorry, I know the camera's not looking in this particular spot. So when you're feeding it out over that edge of the anvil to do those bends, We basically want to be hitting at the very end whenever possible, and then feeding it forward a very even amount. So you're hitting in basically the same place as you're going. It matters the cadence that you're hitting, right? Because if you end up starting to push it a little bit faster or hit a little bit faster, it's going to change how you're actually bending the material. There'll be tighter sections and looser sections. And I have thoroughly made this not look the way that I want it to. So I'm going to take just a second to get this looking a little bit better here. One of the interesting things that I've learned in blacksmithing is that blacksmithing and talking about blacksmithing are two totally different processes. And I do really, really well at blacksmithing when I'm not talking about it. And then as soon as I'm talking about what I'm doing, my brain is split and I'm paying attention to two different things. I'm not going to quite get that, am I? All right, so basically I've got my little handle shape there, and you can see I did my 3D reasoning wrong. So I have that little shoulder on the wrong side. What that's going to allow me to do is flip it around, heat up this section through here, pop it into the vise, and then twist it around. Now the great thing about working at material this size is that we can just use our tongs to walk it right around. As you're twisting something like that, the reason that most of those twisting wrenches have two hands on them is that it's helpful to keep everything nice and level. If you find that it is twisting on you or bending a lot, it's often because we're pushing or pulling as we're twisting. Pop it right in. I want to make sure that I'm capturing it on the original bar. Grab a hold of it and walk it all the way around. Wow, thank you, I'm good. Appreciate it. It would be hard to eat some watermelon while blacksmithing, I think. All right. So we've got our piece here. It's looking pretty good, I think. Got a little bend in there. All right. So now we're going to start working on the little candle cup. Now let's talk about this a little bit. This particular shape, I have them laser cut them, I think. But it's super easy to just take a piece of metal and chisel out a little section. I find that it's a little bit easier when I'm teaching my classes to just have a whole bunch of these. And indeed, I'm lucky. I just get these holes pre-drilled, so it's all in one piece. What I need to do with this is I need to bend it. I need to bend it really significantly. And what I'm going to do is make sure that as I'm working on my piece, I'm hammering over air. One of the major challenges with this particular thing is that if I'm not holding it totally straight on my piece of my tooling here, it will go off at a little bit of an angle and it will curl up not totally straight. Now, I can definitely do this cold but I like getting those first bends in hot. And it doesn't take very long for that to heat up enough to bend it really easily. The tricky part by doing it hot ends up being that, it's hard to hold on to, right? Lucky for me, that little tab makes it just a little bit easier. Now I have, you can't see it, but I have a tiny little piece of scrap metal in the forge that's just enough so that it provides a little lift on those pieces, so I can get my tongs in underneath it. There is nothing more annoying than not being able to grab it out of the forge once you've got it in there. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to be using the peen of the hammer over air to just get that bend started. And as I'm going, I'm hitting down on it as I'm moving it around. So I've got this nice little cup shape here, but it's getting to the part where I'm not going to be able to get my hammer in there for very much longer. So I've also got this tool right here, just a piece of metal rod rounded onto some flat bar. The flat bar helps it not roll off the anvil. And these were made by Dave Smucker. He's actually the person who crafted this particular project, and I loved it so much I asked him if I could teach it to my students. So once I've gotten this sort of bent like this, I'm going to take this and put my other piece down on it and use that sort of as a set of tongs. Bend it right around there. Once it's bent in, I will actually be able to lift it up and move it around to get to the areas that I haven't been able to reach yet. And because I know that the piece is square, when I'm taking a look at this and noticing that the ends here are not fully lined up, that's an indication to me that I haven't fully bent it all the way around. The way that this particular piece is designed, there is just a little bit of a space in there to be able to sort of squeeze that candle cup a little bit tighter or looser depending upon your candle. One of the things that you'll notice is that if you are hitting and your piece of metal is bending, typically there's a particular sound for it. That bending sound, to me, sounds more like tick, tick, tick. And the smushing sound, where you're hitting the metal when it's between the hammer and the anvil, that smushing sound to me sounds a little bit more resonant. It's really important to be able to pay attention to those noises because you can't always see what you're doing. If you can't see what you're doing, you might not actually know whether you're inadvertently bending it or inadvertently smushing it. So I've got this piece here. It's looking pretty straight. It's actually off by just a little, so I'm going to pop it back into the forge and reheat. And with these tiny pieces, they don't take very much to get reheated. What I tend to do is I tend to get it hot enough and then set it down somewhere where I can sort of tap it so that it racks itself, basically. Let me think. What am I doing? So I'm tapping down on that higher side, and that tends to, it's brought right back into round. Now again, you could do this cold. I just find it takes a little bit less time. I wonder. Nah, it will not. You still see that? Sweet. This little piece here has been shaped very carefully, again, by Dave Smucker. He took a lathe and just knocked off a little bit here so that it will fit a 7/8 inch candle pretty precisely. This little cross piece here works really great to make sure that this whole piece doesn't drop through if you put it into the vise. And this part here, what I like to do is pop my piece on and then use that little window of my tongs to lift it up so that it's level with the top and knock that top piece over. So we end up getting that tab folded over for the rivet. One of the favorite tricky parts of this is that once you get it on here, it can be a little tricky to get off while it's still hot. So I'm just going to go ahead and quench it. Awesome. So we have all three of these little components. Let's take a look. Don't know why I thought that that was hot, but we'll quench it off anyway. There we go. And it looks like my mark on the back that I thought I was so clever with has slipped off. So I'm just going to go ahead and scratch a new one in here. You can actually probably see that line a little bit better now that I've got it all covered in forge scale. What we need to do now is to lay out the placement of these things. And that's going to look like this. I want to have, so I'm working right now off the back of my piece. I want to have my handle off the edge by just a little bit, and I want to put my, my candle cup close to that end. And I want to just go ahead and mark roughly where I want that to go. Oops. Right in the middle. That is marked there. Okay. And where's my marking? The light here. I can't see that at all. So there's that. All right. So I've gotten it marked. And now we get into some of the basic math challenges of blacksmithing, right? That we need to hold our center punch to mark where we're going to drill. We need to hold our backing plate, and we need to hold the hammer, right? The basic math problem is this: I only have 2 hands. In order for me to be able to do this, I need to make sure that my piece isn't going to jump around. Lucky for me, I can solve this math problem by pressing my center punch down where I want this to go, and then taking my hammer and picking this one up, knocking a little bit in. My goodness. Marked this like 3 times now. Alrighty. Then, toss it right on back here. This is not plugged in. That makes it more challenging. It's not plugged in. Oh, it is. Thank you. Aha. So what I'm using for this is actually a center finder drill. Bought it from McMaster Carr. It is a much more, it's a very short drill bit. And it has the countersink on it. So I can do the countersink for the rivet right in there. And of course, it's a really good idea to use cutting oil as well. And then I like to knock off that burr on the other side. That was highly effective knocking it off. There we go. And I need to get this one drilled as well. Again, with that math problem. Pressing down on the center of my hook, or not hook, handle. There we go. Alrighty. So we've got all of our pieces here. I need to get my my rivets out. I need to find my rivets. We might need to take a break for the rivets. What was that?
Also, your head's going way over.
Oh, okay, cool, good to know. I put my rivets in a really great place. That might have to happen after lunch. I'm going to pivot around and start working on my other project, which is the leaf keychain.
What size rivet do you use?
They're 1/8 rivets, 3/8 length. Say again? 1/8, yeah. Nope.
No, it's too big.
Yep. It's all right. I definitely have them. They may have gotten brought into my car. Oh, wait, hang on. You know what? They might be stuck in here. Ah, that'll work. Yeah, we'll just cut them down. Yeah, I'll do that after lunch. 2. Yep. Perfect. Awesome. I'll cut them after lunch. Sweet. Awesome. So, let me tell you, I super duper love these leaf keychains. I think that they are some of the best projects for really diving deeply into making yourself a better blacksmith, right? So for me, when I first got started blacksmithing, I decided eventually that I was like, hey, I'm going to be a really good blacksmith. And in order to do that, I figured I kind of needed to practice one thing over and over again. And so the deal that I made with myself is that every time I went out to the shop, I was going to make a leaf keychain. And the first time, it took me 3 hours. And the second time, it took me 3 hours. And the third time, it took me 3 hours. And I eventually got it down to like 2 hours and 25 minutes, right? But like, it took a long time. And that is part of the challenge of picking up something like this. But what's really been pleasant for me about the Leaf keychain is that this is one of those projects where you can do it over and over and over again and really see yourself developing, right? One of the things I especially like to do, because I'm a weird human, is that because it took me so long to learn how to hammer a point that was truly pointy, I really enjoy putting a stabby point on a Leaf keychain. And I gotta tell you, this is not practical. I am not saying that you should go and do this, but I love the stabby points for my own personal edification, and I really enjoy having them on the Leaf keychain because I like the aesthetics of it. I like just knowing that I'm able to do this. Now, this is one of my favorite projects. Some of you may have seen me do this before. I think it is so crucial to learn how to do this in terms of really stepping up your handwork game. Because what we're doing is we're taking a pretty substantial...
Can I steal a second?
Yeah.
Okay. Are you in a comfortable position?
Yeah, go for it.
I think it's 12:30 for lunch.
Yeah,
Wait,
12:30 is great. Yeah. Yeah.
Mind making the announcement?
Yeah,
You
go
got
for
the
it.
speaker?
Oh, hi, I'm Bruce Manson, and I'm here to tell you that lunch is happening at 12:30.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We're going to move to 12 o'clock back to 12:30. We got a little food delay, and everybody looks like they're having fun.
Perfect.
You okay with that?
Yeah, that's great. We're taking a very substantial piece of material and moving it so that it, like, nothing looks like the original bar, right? So just to walk this through, is my head out of the way now? Okay, cool. Just to walk this through, basically what we're doing is a half two-sided point, right? So it's a nice square point. Then we're going to look down at our piece, and you can see this side of our material is totally flat because I've been hitting it against the edge of the anvil. Or edge of the anvil. I've been hitting it against the face of the anvil. This side, though, you can see my hammer blows. I want to roll it so that one of these flat sides is up. Now, if I'm looking at my screaming hot piece of metal, I might not be able to tell just by looking at the top side whether I've hit there before or not. But it doesn't matter if I'm looking at this face because I can see the edge clearly against the edge of the anvil. So I'm going to roll it so a flat side is up, and I'm going to set it out over that far edge of the anvil. You can see I have here a point, and then I've got a little section that I haven't hit on at all. I want to set that little section that I haven't hit on at all out over that edge of the anvil because it's going to help me shape the shape of my my leaf. I can talk. Words are great. If you take a look at this leaf here, you can see I've got the pointy section, and then I've got a little section here that's sort of parallel. And then down here, it gets thinner again. So that parallel section is this section here. The pointy section is this section here, right? So that helps me to understand if I want a long, narrow leaf, I need to make the point long, and then I need to consider how long I want to make this parallel section, right? And so that just sort of sets me up to understand how what I'm doing at this stage shapes that final leaf shape. I want to do a half-faced blow so my eyes are looking in the very middle of my bar at the edge of the anvil. And I'm taking some pretty substantial blows here to really set that shoulder. And I'm bracing my piece up against my body so it's not moving around. This oftentimes is very challenging for beginners because one of the things that we don't often think about is just how hard it is to hold something steady, right? A lot of the time when folks are holding something, they are putting 100% effort into holding something. And actually what happens when you're doing that is that the nervous system is saying, boss, I'm holding it as tight as I can. I'm holding it as tight as I can. And it's just repeating that over and over and over again. And what's getting missed is the softer voice that's saying, hey, we're off by about 3 inches. We need to move back. And so we're missing that entire dynamic feedback system because we're overwhelming it with holding it as tight as we possibly can. So if you watch blacksmiths who are really comfortable in their work, you'll find that they're holding it steady, but they're not putting 100% effort into that holding. They need to be able to feel the feedback and notice if their piece is moved, okay? So I'm setting it down, half-faced blow. Then I'm looking at the edges again. And you can see up here, this was one of the original flat sides. I am rolling that carefully up. And now you can see that shoulder of the other side. I'm doing a half-faced blow on this side. Really set that shoulder. And then bringing it back to a half-faced blow on the other side. All right, so I get this shape here, which I like to think of as an alien head, right? So we've got the eyes, the nose, the chin, the throat, the spine that runs all the way down the back side. All right? That gets us set up to actually do the smushing and get our beautiful leaf shape. Now I'm using a 1/2 inch round here to make just a slightly larger leaf keychain. Figured it would show up just a little bit better on the camera. Typically I use 3/8 inch square. The 1/2 inch round is sort of a step up. Now typically when I'm doing a point, when I'm by myself, I hit once per side because there's a little bit of an advantage in doing that. When I'm teaching it, I like hitting twice per side because I like reminding folks that what we're trying to do here is get our hammer all the way out at the very end of our piece of metal. If I end up hitting a little bit back from the end, I want a second chance to get my hammer all the way out there before I switch my piece to the other side, right? As soon as I switch my piece to the other side, it's like resetting my brain, right? And if I take that second opportunity to push it a little bit further out, just what we were talking about before, where folks will typically take several hits as they're moving down the bar, right? That's typically what'll happen is if I hit back here and then I take another blow, it's a little bit further down, I stand a better chance of it coming close to the end. A lot of times beginners will ask me, like, if they've popped their piece in for a second heat on a point, they go, oh no, how do I figure out what side to hit on that second time out of the forge? And what happens actually is that if you're making a point and you have to pop it back into the forge and you can't remember what side you were working on, that's okay. So long as you're hitting on a facet, by the second hit, you're good. Because if you roll it around and there's air underneath where you're hitting it, that first blow is going to bend it so that it's in contact with the anvil. And your second side, you'll bend it so it's in contact with the anvil. And basically at that point, it's all flat to the anvil. All of your hits after that are going to be smushes. And so it doesn't really matter unless you've got something really delicate going on. So I'm bringing this piece out. You can see I've got a flat side here, rolling that side up, setting it out over that edge. We've got the point. We've got a little bit set out over the edge of the anvil. Half-faced blow. My eyes are absolutely locked on to the middle of my bar at the edge of the anvil. Roll it over. Oh, I need the other flat side, so this way. And I'm running just a shy bit low on temperature. So I'm going to pop it back in. But you can see here I've got a half-faced blow going on both of those sides. Basically, my alien's developing a chin. Now, if I end up doing it so that the alien head, if one of the sides of the chins is a little bit shorter up than the other side, I'll end up with a leaf shape that's a little bit lopsided at the bottom. But Mother Nature makes these all the time, and I'm no better than Mother Nature. So if that happens to me, we're good, right? But if it's off really dramatically, there are ways to fix that. So for example, if I've got this going here, got a half face blow here, and it slips. So I've got one chin up high and one chin a little bit lower. I can fix that by going up to the higher up chin, holding it really steady, and then rolling it over really steady and hitting down. You can see I got a little double chin going on here, right? By setting that second chin carefully, it will help me to even both of those out. Let me tell you, though, that is one of the challenges. So if this is hard for you to do, please note that's okay, right? It's challenging for everybody. As soon as it starts to slip, just stop, reset it, and hit it again. So I've got the chins started. I think they're looking pretty good. Gravity attack. Now, how many folks here have ever had a leaf keychain that has broken off right at the very base of their leaf? Come on, show of hands. Yeah, that's really common, right? One of the things that absolutely drives me bonkers is that a lot of times teachers will come by and say, oh, you got it too thin right here. But that's not the full story. They say they got it too thin, you got it too thin right there, as if metal that's this thick, a quarter inch, just breaks off all the time with no warning. Well, that's crazy talk, right? We know better than that. But what's going on here is actually that it's the thinnest part of a piece that you're moving around a lot on. And so what's happening is that all of the metal is fatiguing in just that one area. I have two sets of tongues. So, for example, if you think about paper clips, right? The last time you took a paper clip, unfurled it, and broke it, is this a common experience for people still? I want to see some, okay, cool, awesome. This is like how I got through phone calls back in the day, right? Unfurl the paper clip, bend it until it breaks. All of the metal fatiguing is happening between your fingers, right? But if you held that paper clip all the way out at the very end, it would take forever for you to be able to break that paper clip. Because all of the fatiguing, all of the damage being done by you bending that paper clip back and forth would be distributed over a longer area. So it's only by holding it really close together and wiggling it back and forth that you're damaging the metal enough in that one little space that it's breaking easily. So the weird thing is this. If you're worried about your leaf breaking off right at the base of the leaf, right at the top of that stem, you need to make more of that stem thinner to make it more resilient. This is exactly the opposite of what the take-home message your teacher often will say, at least my teachers often. Oh, don't make it that thin there. That's crazy talk. We can make it plenty thin. We just need to make it long enough at that same dimension so that it's resilient. I mean, we can see this. If I took and just sort of squished a little bit with this clay and then wiggled it back and forth, of course it's going to fatigue right where I squished. But if I take a long section and make that whole thing just as thin, it's a challenge. Make it just as thin. And wiggle that back and forth. The whole thing is much more resilient to bending. We are getting a little fatiguing, but that fatiguing is showing up in the places that I've already smushed it. All right, so where are we at? Let's go ahead and take that a little bit thinner. So I'm hitting just behind that edge of the anvil to make it just a little bit thinner, a little bit more resilient there. And then I'm going to go ahead and start smushing that alien head. Am I coming on time? No.
You got a half hour to fit on some of that absolutely necessary equipment out there.
Wait, I haven't had a chance to do any bidding. And my gig ends at 12:30. Don't I get a chance?
Yes.
Okay, cool.
12:31.
So, 12:31. All right. So when I'm smushing that alien face, I want to make sure that the nose and chin are straight up to the sky, right? Because this is how we show love to aliens. I do not condone violence, right? Nose and chin straight up to the sky. Here's a thing that commonly happens. You put your piece down. I have smushed my alien into a big ball of everything. You put your alien face down with the nose and the chin straight up, right? In other words, I'm hitting down on the diamond. Now, if my hammer comes in and I'm at a little bit of an angle, you can see it would want to twist the alien head over. And so sometimes you'll notice that your leaf shape is flattening unevenly, and one side's very, very flat because you have rolled it over, right? And so all of that mass is off to one side now. This is something that happens really commonly. It's often because that hammer's coming down at a little bit of an angle and pulling it over. We can still recover from that and make it even, though, by using the peen of the hammer. Now, let me see a show of hands. How many of you have never seen me do the cow-plop theory of moving metal? 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, cool. It's enough. We're doing it. We're rolling it. I'm going to do it. Well, I'm going to do it anyway. Yeah. So this is a real theory, right? The cow-plop theory of moving metal. Look it up. It's real. The story I'm about to tell you is not true. But I grew up in Vermont, and we lived in a really rural area. The school bus couldn't get all the way back to my house to drop me off. And so they'd sort of stop at the top of the hill, and I had to walk through the cow pasture on the way home, right? And I was about this tall, and crucially, I didn't do any of my own laundry, right? And so as I would be walking home from school, I would occasionally see a nice, fresh meadow muffin, right? Nice, fresh, moist meadow muffin. And so, of course, as a little kid, you just jump in it, right? And stuff splashes out in all directions. It's great fun. Now, that was great entertainment for me for years until that one day that I happened to be bringing a baseball bat home. So I took that baseball bat and I went thwack into a nice, fresh, moist meadow muffin. What happened? Any thoughts? Absolutely. It sprayed out in both directions, right? Away from that baseball bat, which means we can aim that, right? Great fun, great fun. My mom was very upset. But this is all very relevant to blacksmithing because when it comes back down to it, the face of our hammer ends up being the feet. Using that hammer splashes that material away from the center of the hammer. The back side of the hammer acts as a baseball bat. It sends material in just two directions. And so when we get to this point in the leaf, we want to be using the peen of the hammer to move material away from that center. And so what we're going to do is hold our peen so that it's across our leaf this way, and move it from that center out to that edge. And you can see it's looking a lot more even already than it was before. And do it on the other side as well. We actually are able to move that material around really significantly. Pop that back in. So we're going back to bopping it close, or bopping it flat. Nose and chin up, and I'm just hitting to flatten here. And then I'm flipping it around using the peen of the hammer. I'm aiming at the center of my piece, but let's face it, my hammer blows are just a statistics curve. I want most of those hits to be in the center, but I'm not going to be perfect at hitting just in one place. I do want to work hard to make sure that the edges of my leaf are not super thin. Because what I'm going to do is I'm going to draw this all out, make it thinner in the center, fold it over, and pinch it, fold form it, and then open it back up again. And in order for me to have any level of success at opening it back up again, the edges of that leaf have to be more than paper thin, right? They have to be thick enough for me to be able to wedge a chisel in there or something, right? So I'm drawing it out. I flipped it over. Flip it over again. This is helping me to keep that piece relatively even. So I've got that nice leaf shape at this point. What I want to do now is make it thinner in the center. Because when I fold it over, the metal is going to move where it's the hottest or weakest. And it's really hard to get just the center of my leaf hot without having a tool like a torch, right? So what I want to do is make it thinnest in the center so that it's going to bend there when I go and ask it to bend, right? Now, I can do this in a couple of ways. One of the things I have at my disposal here is sort of a rounded chisel. What I'm facing, though, is the prospect of that same old math problem as before. I have to hold my leaf, I have to hold my chisel, and I have to hold my hammer, right? Now, if the anvil is set to an appropriate height, I will be able to hold it between my legs, set it up right here, and hit down and make a mark in the center. If the anvil's not set to the right height, though, that's going to be really challenging for me. I have some other options. One of those other options is going to be actually using the edge of the anvil as a tool to actually make that mark. So what I would do if that was the case is set my piece on the edge of the anvil. You can't really see this, I'm sorry, with the overhead, but hit down on that edge to make a thinner section right in the middle, right? The challenge with this move is that I really can't see what I'm doing, right? And so it's a great move to do if I can't solve that math problem in other ways, right? Just because it basically combines the holding process with the actual top tool. So it solves that math problem. Let me see what I can do. So it looks like I got my chisel set up facing the wrong way. Looks like I'll be able to solve this math problem pretty easily. Set it up on the anvil. It's a little tall for me. So I've got a nice chisel mark right in that center there. You can probably see it better if I put it where the camera can see it. Sometimes I'm real smart. Now, that chisel mark is not very deep, so I run the risk of it not being quite enough to get it to bend, but I'm feeling pretty confident right now. We'll see how that confidence plays out, right? In order to get it to bend, I want to hold it over a section of the anvil where there's air underneath the middle part of my piece. And so I like to hold it basically in this corner between this corner and the horn itself, because there's just a little bit of an angle here that I'll be able to get in there with the peen of my hammer and get that bend started. Then I'll bring it back over to the face of the anvil and hit from both sides to get that bend a little bit more. Once I get it fully bent over, I'm actually going to smush along that edge. Let me demonstrate what I'm doing here. On the horn, can you see this? Bend it down so it's sort of cup-shaped. Bring it to the face of the anvil on the other side. So it's folded over relatively evenly. Then I'm going to smush it on the horn of the anvil using sort of the corner of my hammer, which is going to pinch this and draw this out a little bit. What did that say? Okay, cool, awesome, sweet. Then I'll be able to open it up. It'll look a lot more three-dimensional because I've stretched this edge. This is called fold forming, all right? Go ahead and pull my piece out. See how well I can get it to do the thing that I told you I was going to do. So I've got that cup shape starting. And I'm working it from two sides on the anvil just because sometimes it starts to fold in a way that's not totally even. And by working it from two sides, I can make it a little bit, stand a chance of making it a little bit evener. Evener? Is that a word? Did somebody say, yeah, it was a word? Cool, thank you. I like you. Thank you, I appreciate that. Do you see how the back side of this is not fully flat? It's sort of bent out a little. I've stretched that edge. And by stretching that edge, when I open it up, it'll be more three-dimensional. Now, the next thing we're going to do is we're going to draw out that stem. And I'm working with half-inch material here. And it's a hot day, and I'm a lazy blacksmith. So I'm going to teach you how I do this, which is, as I'm drawing it out, I'm going to be using the peen of my hammer. But you'll notice that if I was using the peen of my hammer to draw it out, I want that material to go in two directions, right? And that puts my hand directly over the hot stuff, which is not a good scene for me. So what I have here is I have a double diagonal peen hammer. So one of these peens goes this way, and then if I flip it over, the other peen goes this way. So this side would move the material wider, which I don't want, and this side would move the material longer, which I do want. I'm going to be using the peen of the hammer in the narrowest section, because that thinnest section moves the material so much easier. I'm not going to bother working on the thick section because that's a lot more work. I am going to take a water break, though. Awesome. So, now I've got that leaf all folded up, which means that it's off the edge of the anvil. I'm hitting on the back side of that thinner section and almost extruding from that thinner section, working on two sides, so I'm keeping it nice and thin, nice and square. Now, this looks dangerously thin, right? I've definitely had teachers that have looked at my my leaves and gone, that's just gonna break off. And it's like, well, maybe. It might break off. But if I'm keeping it relatively flat to the anvil, if I'm keeping it glowing hot, these are two things that are going to make that bend in a way that causes damage to the metal a little bit less commonly. I'm going to pull out here. This is the original size of the bar. Can you see both ends of that here? I'm going to pull it out this way, so you'll be able to see the size of my material, how long it's grown at this point. That is, if my piece ever heats up. All right, so we can see here, it's already grown pretty significantly from my original bar. Could you see that? Not really? Okay, cool. Good talk. So now I'm working in a slightly larger section, but I'm still bringing it all the way down until it's quite thin. It's so much easier to get something that's really thick, quite thin, than to take a long section that's already quite thick and just make it a little bit less, right? Because there's so much more hammering involved, taking something from like a half-inch round down to 3/4 inch square than it is to just work in one tiny little area and use physics to your advantage, right? Just extrude that right on out. Plus, that section gets hot faster, so you're not waiting around quite as long. Does anybody have any questions so far while I'm waiting for my piece to heat up? Any jokes? No? Cool. What was that? Yeah, it's not going to stick together. That's exactly right. It's not going to stick together because I don't have any flux. This forge is not getting it hot enough to do the forge welding on it, and it definitely has oxide, so it's quite dirty. It sticks together quite nicely under slightly different circumstances, right? Did you know that in outer space, where there's no oxygen or less oxygen, that clean pieces of metal will actually cold weld together because there's no oxidation? So like, this is a challenge to be an astronaut, right? Pieces will just weld together. If they're nice and flat and all totally clean, it's like, wow, that's something we really have to strive for back on the planet. So I'm still working in a section that's much, much thinner than all of the rest. And just extruding that out. It's a great word, extruding. Now, when my students do this project, they eventually hit a point in the project where they're like, oh my goodness, please tell me I don't have to do any more hammering to draw out this stem. You have been making us work for what feels like a long time. So I have a technique called the psychological end, which is just sort of like, hey, it's okay. You've been doing this for a long time. Let me just tell you, it's all right. There is an end in sight. So you're going to take your piece of metal that you've been working on. This part of the stem, my clay is really floppy at this point, but you've extruded a bunch. It's nice and thin, and you've got much thicker metal back here. What I do is I do a half-faced blow right at the bottom here on 2 sides. And I just work it down until it's actually quite thin there, because that tells me that I'm just going to be focusing on drawing out the section between my 2 fingers here, right? Where it gets thicker is the end. And back up here, right up at the leaf, right? And so I need to make sure that the whole length of stem is evenly thin in its square form. Because if I try to then take it to round while it's not even, it's going to be a little bit lumpy, and it's not going to bend as easily. So if I work really hard on making it super even, I stand a chance of having that final little loop where I'm bending everything up go beautifully, right? Like if you've ever seen somebody demonstrate this and they get to the part where they're doing the bends and it goes effortlessly and that's never happened for you, it's just because they're taking the extra time to make sure that it's absolutely even. All right. So, helps if I grab the right hammer. Half-faced blow right on that near edge. Again, my eyes are in the middle between the edge of the anvil and the middle of my piece of metal. I'm really working on drawing that out. And I don't mind if it gets thinner than the rest of the bar there, because I'm eventually going to make a point out of that anyway. All right. So what I've got through here is not very even yet. I'm going to go ahead and go back through, working with the face of the hammer to draw that all out, even it all out. I'll get a little extra length, then I'll round that whole thing out. Before we cut it off, I need to remember to open the leaf, because before we cut it off, we have a handle. And if I cut off my handle, I just made life harder for me. And that is not consistent with who I am as a lazy blacksmith, right? So sometimes memory is an important tool in the toolkit. So I know you can't really see this, but I'm working on this narrower section of the anvil here, which is specially designed for exactly this sort of thing. I personally really love anvils that have this double horn shape. Sometimes they're called German pattern anvils. It really makes it a lot easier to get in there for these narrow sections. When you're straightening something out, when you're getting in there to really smush at something, it's very helpful to have that narrower part of the horn of the anvil. So this is sort of the type of anvil that I prefer. At my school, I strongly prefer to have about 200-pound anvils, and here's why. Oftentimes, if you're working on an anvil that's really small, you end up working harder. It doesn't mean you can't use it. It doesn't mean that those anvils are not useful and valuable, but as a blacksmith who is trying to get the message out that you too can blacksmith successfully, sometimes if your anvil is a little bit small and you're working really hard, you can end up internalizing this message that blacksmithing isn't easy for me, right? And if you internalize that message, how long do you think you're going to keep blacksmithing? I mean, unless you're ornery like I am and you really dig in, a lot of people will just sort of drift away from the craft. From my perspective, in a teaching facility, it's really nice to have the slightly heavier anvils so that folks can have that experience of coming in and finding the metal moving easily for them. Let me tell you a quick story. I was down in Tennessee at the AACB blacksmithing conference, and I was demonstrating on a 3.5 350-pound anvil. 3.5-pound anvil is what I was about to say. 350-pound anvil, and I didn't realize how big it was. It looked sort of like a little bit bigger than normal, but like I wasn't really processing the size of it. My typical anvil is about 200 pounds, so this is a lot of additional mass. And I was moving this metal, and it was moving beautifully. And what's my internal messaging? Wow, I'm good at this. This is amazing. Of course I'm standing here demonstrating. I'm great at this. This is fantastic. Later that day, I had the opportunity to work on a 75-pound anvil, and it was not moving for me at all. What was my messaging? My messaging was, wow, you're so bad at this. Why do you think you can make a living blacksmithing, right? And that goes to show, I wasn't thinking about the size of the anvil. I was internalizing this as something about me. And so from my perspective, if you know that the anvil you're using is a little bit light for the work that you're doing, good. That means that you are less likely to apply it as a belief about yourself as a blacksmith and your own skills. And you're more likely to attribute it to the frustrations of working with a smaller anvil, right? Yeah, because that 75-pound anvil, it was up a little bit too high, and it was on a rickety stand, and so it was bouncing with every move. I couldn't even keep up with it, right? And so it was really, really nice to have that contrast in the same day, because you can really tell the difference between those two. And that doesn't mean that you have to have those larger anvils, but if you're struggling to move that material efficiently, it can be really helpful to upgrade your tooling so that you don't quit the craft just because the metal's not moving as easily. So I've gotten this relatively thin, relatively even. What I'm going to do next is I'm going to round it all out. And again, we're holding it up on the diamond, walking down those edges, rotating it over, walking down those edges. You'll notice, again, I'm sorry, I chose to have the camera facing here, not on this side, because I wanted it zoomed in close enough so you could see. I apologize, this is the part it's going to be a little harder for you to see. But I'm walking down those edges first to bring it from square to octagonal to 16-agle to 32-agle. Then I'm rolling it as I'm doing light overlapping blows to round it all out. No, we're in good shape. It's fine. It'll just be like a few minutes. Unless, do y'all want the anvil moved? Yeah, sure. Okay. Perfect. 5 minutes. 5 minutes. It's fine. It's fine. Everything is fine. No pressure. Just 5 minutes to finish this. Yeah. And again, if you start rolling it around before you've knocked off all the edges like I'm trying to do, you do run the risk of twisting your material. For this particular application, I'm not so worried about it because for this particular application, having a slightly textured stem when I've only got 5 minutes, we're in good shape, right? Do a little bit more rounding on that, pop it open. All right, let me pop it open. If I've done this correctly, it will be able to pop open. Yeah. So I've gotten that hardy cutoff tool right in the middle there. Then I'm going to put it right on the edge of the anvil. Doing this a little cold, but we got that open, which is pretty much what we're looking for here. So what I need to do is I need to finish opening it, cut it off flip it around, put a point on it, and then curl the whole shebang up. It's probably going to be 2 minutes overtime. Y'all okay with that? Okay. I'm hurrying. Had to tell that story, didn't you? All right. Opening it up just a little bit further. Now we're going to go ahead and cut it off. Hardy cutoff tool, we want to just hit just enough so you don't have a piece of screaming hot metal flying into the crowd. You're welcome. We've got that tiny little notch on the side there. I'm going to go ahead and grab it at 90 degrees close to that notch and wiggle it off. From here, I'm going to set this down someplace safe. Safe. Flip this around and pop it right back in. I want to make a quick point, round that point out, do a little curlicue, and bend it all up. This is basically exactly what you saw at the very beginning of my demo, so if you're hungry and you need to get in the lunch line, that's also okay. The challenge at this point is the fact that I have cut off my handle. So it's really, really easy for that leaf to rotate. It's a little bit less easy for it to rotate because I've bent it and done that fold forming. So there's a little bit more for my tongs to grip. But this version of it here, that's flat, it moves all over the place. So that can be a little challenging. What we're doing is just making a little point at that very end. If I'm hitting hard enough and fast enough, sometimes I'll actually be able to heat that metal up a little bit. I always want to start my bends while it is fully hot, right? It's very, very tempting a lot of the times to, you're right at the tail end of a heat and you're like, I could just bend it now. From my experience, you'll end up getting bends in places that you don't want. So when it's fully hot, nice and evenly hot, it'll bend the best. Out over that far edge of the anvil, hit it down, flip it over, bend it back. On that far side of the anvil, hit as you're rolling down. We've got that nice curlicue. I am popping it back in for one more go here. I'm going to quench off just that little curlicue at the very end. The more evenly I have this section heated, the more evenly it's going to curl, and having it nice and even throughout makes it a lot easier to do that final step. And we've got Bruce coming in here. He's probably about to tell me it's time for lunch. So I better do that last step really quick. Out over the horn of the anvil. You can't see this, I'm sorry. Bring it around. And then close it right on up. That is not round at all, but y'all have to eat some lunch. So we're gonna call that a day. Say that again. Thank you, thank you. Y'all are so wonderful.